The following program is a Town of Colonie television production of the William K. Sanford Town Library.
Hi, welcome to the latest episode of Mental Health Now. I'm your host, Matthew Shapiro from the National Alliance on Mental Illness, New York State. And today we're going to be talking about one of the most important issues and one of our really primary advocacy issues, which is housing, which is so crucial to recovery from any type of mental health episode. As we often say, housing is health, and it's all recovery starts with proper housing. And too many people living with a mental illness don't get access to proper housing. Either they're in the hospitals or in worst case scenarios on the street or in shelters or jails and prisons. So today we're going to be talking about the importance of housing, and I'm very honored to be joined first by Tiffany Monti, who can tell you firsthand the importance of housing. So hi, Tiffany.
Hi.
Welcome today.
Thank you for having me.
Oh, thank you for being here. I should mention we also have another special guest, your emotional support dog, Sweet Pea, so
Yes.
people might see her come in and out of the picture. So Tiffany, you were someone you were telling me before, was diagnosed with a younger age with a mental illness. Do you want to tell a little bit about your story?
Yeah, well, basically what it was, growing up in school, I was always learning disabled, and but they didn't classify me as anything in particular. It was just learning disabled. When I was really young, they thought I was autistic. It was never really, that's really what it was, learning disability. But even in school, I noticed I was different. I was a lot more emotional than the rest of the kids. And then as I got older, it just got worse. Mm-hmm. And my father died when I was a young kid, when I was 9. And basically, so as I got older, it got worse. And I graduated high school and started college. And even though I was doing okay in school, I was having a hard time. And I was very unhappy with the way my life was going and the way I was feeling. I just couldn't really express how I was feeling. Mm-hmm. And then ultimately what ended up happening was around the age of, I would say my early 20s, I ended up having a major breakdown where I ended up locking myself in my mom's bathroom and attempting to kill myself. My mom called the cops because she couldn't get in. Mm-hmm. And that's how I ended up with my diagnosis of bipolar. Mm-hmm. And
yeah, so obviously that initial diagnosis is always difficult, but your journey obviously is a little more difficult because through various circumstances, and we don't have to get too into it, but you were saying that you were actually homeless for a while in a homeless shelter before you got into a housing program.
Well, what ended up happening was my mom, after losing my father, she was a single mom to 3 kids. Mm-hmm. And she could not financially support what she needed to do, and she ended up having to sell her house that she owned. She ended up having to sell her house that she owned, and renting from somebody. And on the rental thing, she could not put 2 adult children. It couldn't be 3 adults in a 2-bedroom. Mm-hmm. The way they put it, I don't remember the exact guidelines. But the bottom line was, I had the choice because I had the diagnosis and I was working with a social worker and they were already working to get me out anyways. So what ended up happening was she sold her house and, she went into that apartment and with my brother, and I was waiting for spa housing to come through. Mm-hmm. And so it was a brief period. It was only like 6 weeks, but the fact that I didn't have a home did rush it along, and it was the support that rushed it along.
Right. So you say it was only 6 weeks, but obviously here you are, you're in your early 20s.
I'm in my early 30s.
No, but at the time you were in your early 20s, I'm saying, excuse me. And you had just been diagnosed with a mental illness and living in a homeless shelter. That must have been very difficult, being in the shelter.
Oh, it was honestly, the only thing that really helped was the fact that I did have a home to go to. It was the fact that I had my mom. My mom, she was there for me, even though she couldn't house me, she was there for me. I would go home to her during the day. She was there every step of the way. She was with me talking to doctors. You know, she was there for me. So that, the fact that I had her, the fact that I had a home to go to was crucial. But those shelter environments, they're shoving 10 women into a room, or you know, you sleep on little cots if you're lucky. If you're lucky to have that, there are people sleeping in sleeping bags.
Right.
You know, it depends on the shelter you go to.
It's a traumatic experience.
It's not a fun experience, and it's not an easy experience at all.
And very easily, for someone who has mental illness, can make it much worse because it is traumatic.
Yeah. Oh, honestly, the majority of people who are homeless probably have some form of something, whether they're diagnosed or not. But just the fact, if they didn't have it before, they're gonna have it afterwards. You know, it's like going into jail. You know, you're gonna have a mental illness coming out of jail, whether it's PTSD or something. You know, being homeless is not a fun experience.
So luckily, your stay at the shelter was short, as you said, 6 weeks, and then you got into different types of supporting housing that's designed to aid mental health recovery. So I want to know a little bit about the experience. As you explained to me, there were 3 different types of step-ups. So tell me about the first type of housing you were in.
Well, the first, it's all within the same agency, but the first was a community residence, which is basically 10 people in a house, 24-hour supervision. Even though you're an adult, it's basic. You're not allowed to be home alone. It's, in my opinion, it's a minimized version of a hospitalized. It's not, you know, some people really need that kind of supervision, but ultimately, and it's not, you know, it's recovery focused depending on the agency and the staff, but it's really not helpful.
Right.
And it's important. Housing is important. Like having a place that you can go to. That first step was important, but the turnover in staff, that was horrible. Every time I build trust with somebody and start being able to talk about things with somebody, goodbye.
Right, and you know, we talk about this so much that it's so important that you have continuity of care. Anyone who's watched the show knows we talk about this, that in recovery, when being in a recovery team, you really need to build up a rapport with your provider, whether it's a therapist, a psychiatrist, whatever the case may be, and that takes time, it takes trust, and it's very hard when you kind of have that lack of continuity. It's a different person.
And I don't blame them. A lot of the staff that did leave, they left because they couldn't get paid.
Right.
They weren't making the money for what needed to be done.
Right. And
so I don't blame them.
Right. And obviously money is always a big concern because you said the housing is overcrowded right now. And
understaffed.
And understaffed. And one of the things that you told me, which was surprised me, that due to the lack of funding, they have to put all sorts of people in a house together. So it was, you know, male and female. And you said here you were in your early 20s at the time, and there was a man who was in his 80s there.
Suffering with dementia. He'd been in the agency for a lot longer than I had been.
Of course.
But yeah, he was suffering from dementia, and he was in the agency.
Right. And so that mix is always tough because here you are again in your 20s and you had your sights set on recovery, and you see someone.
I actually, at the time, I was so sick, I didn't know where I was going. I wanted to recover, I wanted to feel better, but I didn't know what that looked like. You know? I just knew I wanted it.
Right. But it had to have been somewhat disheartening when you see older people who have been there much longer and you say, well, if they're not going to recover, maybe I'm not going to recover.
It made me honestly feel like, okay, this is not, what am I going to do? You know, this is something I got to deal with, which is why I was in the community residence for so long, because not just the changeover of staff, but the environment, the different people coming in and out, the lack of privacy, the lack of support, you know.
Lack of support.
Yeah, you know, the CR was just a tough way to live.
Right, and the staff there have a very difficult job because they're so overtaxed. You were saying that they work 24-hour shifts.
Yeah, depending, or if, you know, like for example, if a snowstorm hits and the next shift can't get in, guess what? They're stuck. They can't just throw us out on the streets.
It's very difficult work and very underappreciated work because, like you said, they really helped you in your recovery. Now, how long were you in that first?
I don't know. It was a couple. I was in the agency
months.
from 2010 to 2015. I was in the CR at least half the time.
Okay. So then you graduated or stepped up to the second type of housing.
Yeah, this
which
is when my recovery really started. I ended up in supportive housing. I think it's supportive.
Yeah.
Anyways, I ended up in the second, which is basically you live in a house with two other people. You all get your own room. You get run of the house, and staff comes in routinely to check on you. 5 days a week really is what, on that level, it's like 5 days a week. But it's not 24-hour supervision. You have a key to the house. It's a lot more independent.
Right, it's gearing you towards that full independence. So it's like a in between.
Yeah.
So you were there, and you said that was a very good
I
experience.
rushed through that level. I was out of that level within a year. I moved up within a year because once I got to that level, I felt so good. I felt so supportive. I was, it was like, whoo, I can do this,
Right.
And I was motivated at that point.
So then you graduate to the next step, which, can you just describe the third level?
The third level is great because ultimately what it is you live in a house again with two people. It's every agency is a little different, but yeah, it's basically what it is. Some people have it's only two people. Some houses agency have three, but ultimately it's what it is. So I lived in a house with two other women. And you're completely independent. All we had was a resident manager that would come in once a week to have conversations with us, and he'd take our rent checks. We did everything on our own. And that's the level of housing that really is very important because you get the support. I mean, if he needed to come in more than once a week, he would be there. But it depended on the needs at the time, really. But he was only mandated. I think he was only mandated to come in once a month, actually. But it was very, it was very independent. It makes you would also have the support of the agency, so you'd still have the same supports, yet in the same respect, you were living on your own, basically.
Okay, and that's awesome. And then so you left the housing program, and then what happened? Where did you end up after that? You got
basically
your own apartment?
I ended up I ended up getting into a subsidized housing. They have them all over. They're not as common, but they do have places that have subsidized housing where if you are under a certain income or between a certain income, in this case, your rent is not really based on your income, but it's stagnant. Like the place I lived at for a studio, if you met the income standards, it was only $950 a month. Where normally that kind of place would go for like $1,400, $1,500.
And
so
and you're doing really well today. You're a great advocate. You're working. Can you tell what kind?
So basically,
about the work you do?
When I started at the second level, I had gone through animal behavior college. And I did a lot of volunteering in the shelters, and animals was really where I found my recovery, because when I found the unconditional love of a dog, I was able to find the unconditional love within myself.
Right.
So, that's where, I started off volunteering in animal shelters. Then I went into animal behavior college, got my dog training certificate. It's not really in the state of New York. You really don't need a certificate to dog train, though. But I learned about it. And then eventually ended up applying for a job at Dogtown in Southold, where I ended up shining. I still work there to this day. I've been there for almost 4 years. And I say it all the time, I have the best bosses in the world.
Well, you're so lucky. So how important was housing, would you say, to your recovery?
Housing was, when I was struggling, my bosses saw the possibilities in me. They took me in, but they didn't have to give me what they did. That wasn't their job. Right. They didn't have to, but they did. They saw the possibilities in me, and they took me under their wing, and they helped me find an apartment. They were there for me. They supported me. They went over my budget with me, how to do this. They did all that stuff with me. And so for me, housing is crucial, because when I wasn't in stable housing and working there, guess what? I was struggling there. But once I found my stable housing, I was not struggling anymore.
That's fantastic. And obviously, you said the staff played a huge role in
that. Yeah, and I'm still in communication with a bunch of the staff that helped me, like Sue Paranella from ADD. She was the MH director at the time. I don't know what she is now, but her title has changed. I don't know what her technical title is anymore. But at the time, she was the MH program director, and we sit on the board of directors together.
That's awesome. So, I think most of the final question I'm going to ask you is so important. What would you say to people who don't understand why it's important to invest in housing? There's so many things that obviously the state needs to be invested in, and we'll talk a little bit more about how these housing programs are supported and everything, but what would be your message to the governor or someone who helps decide how funding for housing is going to go?
My message would be, go live on the streets for a day and not have any option to any finances and not know what it's like to be in that position, and then decide on funding, because funding is, we need money to do things, of course, that's what we do. However, money is money more important than people? Is money more important than people's health and safety? I personally would say no. Right. And that's what having housing is. It's your health, it's your safety. And I'm not just talking mental health, I'm talking physical health. Because when your mental health struggles, your physical health struggles.
Right. That's why we always say housing is health.
Yeah, so when my message would be, go find out for yourselves how important housing is. Don't just listen to me. Go on the streets and go find out. Talk to the people, because everybody will tell you having a home is crucial.
It's crucial. Everything starts. Most people take it for granted. They don't even realize it. But thank you so much, Tiffany, for sharing your story, being such an awesome face for recovery. And we know that even you can be in a bad situation, and with the right services and support, you can recover. So, and as we say all the time at Mental Health Now, that hope starts with you. So thank you for putting a face to hope on recovery and telling your story.
Thank you for having me.
Of course.
And thank you for the work you do.
Oh, thank you. Hi. So we're back on Mental Health Now to continue our discussion about the importance of housing to recovery. And I'm very pleased to be joined by Antonia Lasicki, who's the head of the Association for Community Living. So thank you for joining us, Tony.
Thank you for having me, Matt.
Of course. So very briefly, can you explain a little bit about what ACL does, the Association for Community Living?
Sure. So ACL is a membership organization of nonprofits that provide a variety of services to people with mental health challenges. But the thing that they all have in common in order to be a part of ACL is that they all do mental health housing. So every single one of my organizations, one of ACL's members, have contracts with the State Office of Mental Health or with counties to do mental health housing. That's housing for people with serious and persistent psychiatric disabilities.
Right. So in our last segment, Tiffany, I think, explained very well how housing was very important to her recovery. But in your opinion, can you talk a little bit why housing is so important to recovery?
Sure. So often folks find themselves in hospitals or in other settings that are not ideal. But particularly if they're coming out of a hospital, they might have complicated medication regimens. They might have medical conditions that they're not completely comfortable managing. They're not necessarily able to get themselves to appointments. So if they're in a housing program with supports, the staff will take care of those things. They'll make sure that the medications, the prescriptions are filled, that they're taking them correctly. They train people how to take their medication correctly, so there's medication supervision, room and board. Sometimes people don't really know how to cook or take care of themselves or wash their clothes or do any of those things. So housing programs get people to the point where they can live on their own later. So there's a continuum of housing programs in the state of New York. Some have very high levels of care, and then there's sort of a progression, and people can go to much lower levels of care and be quite independent. Right,
and Tiffany actually did a really good job of describing the different step-ups and the different levels she was at, and we'll get to that in a second. One thing I want to talk about, I think it's a large misunderstanding. I think there's still that very old-fashioned way of thinking that the best place for someone with a serious mental illness, and we can define that how you want, is in a hospital setting, in a long-term hospital setting, and that was the way way of thinking for a long time, but we know better now. Can you explain why putting someone in a community housing setting is much more beneficial to them than being in a hospital?
Well, sure, because, if you're in a hospital, you're not really learning anything. A hospital's purpose is really to treat someone and get them to the point where they leave. So, for instance, if you go into a hospital for a physical issue, you may be there for a couple of days and then you go home to recover.
Right.
This is, the community-based housing is like going home to recover.
Right.
Really, in a hospital, it should be short-term. Maybe you need medication adjustment. Maybe something has to happen. But really, people should move back out of the hospital as quickly as possible. Long-term hospitalization is not really necessary, and I don't really, for the vast majority of people, and I don't really think they help people recover in any way, because you can't really learn much in a hospital. You can learn if you're in the community.
Right. And the other benefit, too, of course, you get all the benefits of a hospital, because we talk about housing with wraparound services, like you talked about having staff that make sure people take the medication they need, get the treatments they need, plus the other life skills. We've had a guest on before who talked about how the benefits of housing. So can you describe a little bit more of a technical sense the different levels of housing and the difference between supported housing, SROs? There's so many different kinds of people. I think people get confused in the alphabet soup a little bit.
There is quite an alphabet soup. So we have the older models that I think lay people think of as group homes. Those are, 8 to 17, 18 beds in a house. People share bathrooms in the kitchen and that kind of thing. It's it's kind of a homey atmosphere. Then those are licensed. They're considered treatment facilities. It's a very high level of care. Then there's something called a licensed treatment apartment, where people will move into an apartment in the community with 2 or 3 people. So they have a couple of roommates. It's also a very high level of care, also licensed. The staff can go in every day and work with people to make sure that they're on track. Then there's unlicensed programs. So you have scattered site supported housing, which you can get your own apartment, and then the staff go in to check on you occasionally. So they might go in once a month or 4 times a month or 6 times a month. So you kind of, it's a progression.
Right.
And then what you mentioned, the CRSROs and SPSROs, those are larger congregate facilities. The CRSROs often have, everybody has their own studio apartment. They have a mailbox. It looks like an apartment building, but at the same time, it's licensed and there's a lot of support there. So there can still be medication supervision in a CRSRO. A support SRO is similar, except it's not licensed and it's a lower level of care.
Right.
So there isn't the kind of intense supports in an SPSRO. So, urban areas tend to have the larger congregate facilities. You won't find those in rural areas or small cities.
Right. And what's available here in the Capital Region?
The Capital Region is primarily community residences, treatment apartments, and a lot of scattered site supported housing. We don't have CRSROs or SPSROs. They're too big, and they don't really fit the community. So we have much smaller programs here in the Capital Region.
Right. Okay. So a question we get a lot. Now, if you have a loved one or a friend, you're concerned about their mental health, you think they might need a housing program, what steps would you take to get them into a proper program?
So the first thing to do is contact the county. So the county, every county has a Department of Mental Health, and the counties are the single point of access for housing. So the application has to go through the county. You do need to have certain kinds of paperwork, like a psychosocial, or so there needs to be a certain amount of paperwork. Most people have a psychiatrist or a clinician of some kind, and they would work with that clinician to make sure the paperwork goes in. But the first call is really probably to the county. Single point of access. If you go on their websites, the SPOA coordinators are always listed there. They're very easy to find.
Yeah. Great. So, as you talked about, a lot of the housing you have to be licensed, and so that's licensed through the Office of Mental Health, right?
Correct.
Right.
So the Office of Mental Health licenses the community residences and the treatment apartments. The apartment is actually licensed. Yeah.
I see. So,
and there's a lot of oversight.
Right. So that's exactly that's a nice segue, because that's where I was going to go with this. A lot of oversight, a lot of staff. Tiffany talked about her relationships with the staff and how one of the biggest challenges was there's been a lot of staff turnover. I'm sure we're seeing that all over the state. Can you talk about the different roles, the different type of staff? I mean, I think people just think, oh, you just need someone to supervise, but it's much more than that, correct?
The staff people in the programs?
Well, yeah, I mean, all the different type of staff we're talking about,
Yeah, so we don't have a lot of different kinds of staff. We have, it's these programs use paraprofessional staff people. They have to have a high school diploma and 5 years experience, or an associate's degree and a couple years of experience. So they staff the programs 24/7. They're called direct care staff people. And they're the ones who make sure that the dinner gets ready and the medications are supervised and that people are engaged in recovery goals. Then there's a program manager, and that's about it.
Right. But maybe more to my point was that the staff person wears a lot of hats, right?
Oh, yes.
Which was like you're kind of saying at one
Yes.
point you can be doing case management,
Yes.
and in an hour you could be cooking
Yes.
meals. So
Yes.
these
Yes. Yes.
it's complicated work.
Yes,
I mean,
it's complicated work, and people don't get credit for it. So
Right.
think about this. So you're at 6 o'clock, everybody in the house needs to take medication. So you're supervising complicated medications, sometimes not just for psychiatric illnesses, but
Right,
for medical
sure.
conditions as well. So people tend to have 6 to 12 different medications that they're taking, each person.
Right.
So that staff person has to supervise all those medications. At the same time, they have to make sure dinner gets on the table. They also have 1 or 2 people they're primarily responsible for, and they have to engage in their rehabilitation goals. So they have to actually do a service with those people that the provider can bill Medicaid for. They have to write notes that will pass Medicaid muster. They have to, de-escalate any crises in the house, make sure everybody's getting along, if there's a dispute over, the television or whatever, so they have to deal with that. People might show up at the door that might not be welcome. So there's an awful lot going on in a house at one time, and that staff person has to be on top of all of it. It's very difficult. I did it myself many, many years ago when clients were not nearly as challenging and people weren't on so many medications. So it's a tough job.
Wow, and I thought I wear a lot of hats in a small nonprofit, but one of the other misconceptions that kind of goes a little bit along with the hospitals is that family members who have their loved ones in a facility, it's because they don't want to take care of it or they don't care about the loved one, but that's not the case at all. We care very much, and we want to see that our loved ones get taken care of properly, and we get the same type of care they would get from us. And relationships are so important in that. Tiffany talked about that a little bit, that we want to have, to understand subtle changes in somebody that might, be, a hint that there's a bigger problem going on. And you really need to know someone well to know those little changes of behavior. And so we like to have nice long-term staff that build up the relationship. Our viewers of the show have heard me talk about recovery teams, and you really need relationships and trust. So that's key, but that's been a big of a challenge. I mean, Tiffany talked about it, and there's been a lot of staff turnover. Can you talk about why that's happening and what we're trying to do to prevent that?
Sure. The programs are basically underfunded. The state has not given regular increases to the programs over the years. There is a statutory COLA for the programs in
a COLA being a cost of living
adjustment, yes. But that's gotten waived every year for the last 7 years, except last year when it was a 0.2% increase. So the increases are few and far between. So the programs have not been able to really keep up with inflation. That means that they're not able to pay enough to keep people in these very complicated jobs. And so the staff turnover is a lot. There's a lot of people who come and go. It's a problem for us.
It's a huge problem.
It's a huge problem, and it impacts people's recovery. So, it's, as Tiffany explained, because I've talked to her before, she thinks that she could have recovered and moved through much more quickly if she had had stable staff and the same staff the entire time. And like you said, subtle differences. The other thing is people do have medical conditions, and sometimes a symptom, something they're experiencing, might not be due to their mental illness, it might be due to a diabetic condition or some other condition. And if you really get to know somebody and you can say, that is really not a symptom of their psychiatric illness, it's something else. Let's take a look at this from from a medical point of view, or let's take a look at this from a psychiatric point of view. The staff get to know somebody well, and they can work, they know what those things are.
Right. So, I mean, it's the same way. When I deal with, I've talked about on the show how my mom has mental illness, and I can know when something's up, you know, just as soon as you pick up the phone, as soon as you see her, and ideally you'd like that type of relationship with staff. So what are you trying to do to increase the investments in housing so we can keep and sustain staff and create those type of relationships that are so key to recovery?
So we've launched a Bring It Home campaign. Our campaign is called Bring It Home, Better Funding for Better Care. And it's a statewide campaign. We've just launched a week and a half ago. We've already gotten a lot of media attention. And we're trying to get as much media attention as possible so that we can really focus government policymakers and decision makers on this issue. I have gone in every year behind the scenes. I usually do it behind the scenes. I go to the governor's office and the department, the division of the budget and the Office of Mental Health. But this year we decided that we need to elevate our profile a bit and try to bring some real focus to the problem in the public eye.
Well, and it's so important because we know without proper housing, it can, lead to much more disastrous results. So it seems like proactive investments in proper housing and proper staff can prevent things like homelessness, long-term hospitalizations, even entry into the criminal justice system. So it's much more bigger than just housing.
And from it's not just better from the point of view of the person with the mental illness and their families, but also for the taxpayer, because if somebody ends up in a hospital, that could cost $300,000 a year.
Right.
Jails and prisons are $55,000, $65,000, $75,000 a year. And sometimes people get incarcerated for small things, and then they end up in a jail or prison. They don't have their medications. They decompensate. They do something in the prison or jail that gets them a further sentence, and before you know it, somebody who did something so small can be in a prison for years at a very high, which destroys their lives. Their poor families who have to deal with that, and then the taxpayer who pays that bill. It's counterproductive.
It is counterproductive. Not to mention, another consequence is going into the ER. We know ERs are like the worst equipped to handle people with mental illness, and they end up more traumatic. And not only are these more expensive, but they come out worse than they went in. But unfortunately, when we're out of time, I think there's so much more we can discuss about this issue. It's like I said, I think one of the biggest issues in the mental health movement is you can't recover, you can't live without having a safe and affordable place to live in a place that's really your home. So,
we have proved that they can. We have proved that people can do that. They can live in the community, in a home, and they can recover. But we do need the resources, so it's Bring It Home, Better Funding for Better Care.
Yeah. Great. And there's a Facebook page if you want to see it, and we'll have more on our website too. And Tony, thank you for everything that you do, and thank you for joining us today.
Thank you, Matt. Thanks so much.
And thank you so much for watching. We'll see you next time on Mental Health Now.